When you look back through the history of the United States Navy, you find plenty of brilliant ships and revolutionary designs. But mixed in with those triumphs are some decisions so bizarre, so fundamentally flawed, that you can't help but wonder how they ever left the drawing board. Few ships embody that feeling of what a colossal waste of steel more than the Kearsarge-class of battleships. Even to a casual naval history fan, something about them just looks wrong. And the moment you see their armament, especially that infamous superposed turret, everything starts to make sense. The design was a nightmare, a top-heavy, overcomplicated contraption that caused blast interference, created firing problems, and was so massive that the ship constantly rode low, with their decks awash and permanently soaked. The result, battleships that were in practice anything but. They never lived up to their role, they barely performed in service, and they stand today as one of the strangest missteps in early American naval engineering. But that won't stop us. If anything, it makes them even more interesting. So let's dive in and explore just how disastrous these ships really were. The United States Navy of the late 19th century was certainly not the United States Navy of the Second World War or today. It was a small force, mostly comprising obsolete vessels left over from the American Civil War. But by the mid-1880s, the nation had a need to modernize and grow the fleet with outside threats such as Brazilian battleship construction. Thus, the construction of newer capital ships was considered and was being started. However, Congress was hamstringing further development of the Navy due to budgetary reasons, and 3 seagoing armored ships had been authorized, including Maine and Texas. There were also several monitors from the 1870s kicking about, Monterey, the new cruising monitor, and a new ram, which comprised the Navy's modern force. Through continued talks between Congress and the Policy Board of the Navy, there was some realization of threats posed by outside powers, notably Britain and her modern battleship fleet, of which during the time of the talks in 1890, 7 of her 20 modern battleships could operate from their home bases and go to the United States East Coast, while they had 10 more under construction that could match those capabilities, not to mention their Caribbean or Canadian bases. The French, on the other hand, had some Caribbean bases and were in the process of digging the Panama Canal, a prospect that could put American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere into doubt. After the limited success of the Indiana and Iowa classes, the United States Navy looked to create new and more powerful battleships. There were questions as to the main battery, with some preferring the 12-inch guns and others preferring 13-inch guns. Each had their drawbacks, with the preceding Indiana class with 13-inch guns having weight issues. Something we've covered previously was just being revealed. By 1896, only Indiana was in service. Still, another part of the issue was how heavy the 8-inch secondary batteries were on the Indiana class. Still, the Navy preferred their penetration value over smaller 6-inch guns that were available, so they looked to compromise and find a way to fit what they wanted onto a battleship that weighed full load close to 13,000 tons. Like other design processes, there were multiple iterations of the Kearsarge-class, and one of the major worries was the blast effect of the 8-inch guns on the 5-inch battery. So in Design E, which again was further changed, as this had 12-inch guns instead of the 13-inch ones that were chosen, it was proposed to rigidly fix the 8-inch gun turrets onto the 12-inch turrets. The designer argued that the 8-inch turret would actually gain considerable in protection since its barbette would be the barbette of the lower turret. Weight was going to be saved as compared to the Indiana class, almost 40 tons. But I think one of the major factors that Dr. Norman Friedman writes about in his book, U.S. Battleships and Illustrated Design History, in which he writes, it could be argued that under many circumstances, it might be desirable for the 8-inch guns to fire on some part of an enemy ship other than that of which the 12-inch guns would fire. To which Strauss, the designer, replied that in practice, even a large ship was a small target at any realistic battle range, so that all guns would be generally pointed at her middle. At shorter ranges, since the 8-inch guns fired 2 or 3 times while the heavier ones loaded, the double turret could train back and forth to allow them to engage their own targets. Further changes to the design occurred as I mentioned, with tests showing that the 13-inch guns were the most viable option. so the 8-inch guns were going to be fixed to the tops of 13-inch gun turrets. The two Kearsarge-class battleships were immediately recognizable thanks to their unusual arrangement of their main batteries. Citing the 8-inch battery proved contentious, as there were several groups lobbying for their preferred design for the battleship. An ad hoc board selected superposed turrets based on two perceived advantages. They were not expected to cause muzzle blast interference issues, and their protection, logistics, and control could be consolidated into the existing 13-inch turret. As Rear Admiral Frank M. Bennett explained in his 1896 work, The Steam Navy of the United States, A History of the Growth of the Steam Vessels of War in the United States Navy and the Naval Engineering Corps. The battleships have been designed for 11,500 tons displacement, and will in general be very much like the Iowa Battleship No. 4 in build and design and arrangement of machinery. A decidedly new feature has been adopted for these big ships in locating the turrets for the 8-inch guns on top of the 13-inch gun turrets. Although sturdy and powerfully armed for their size, the class revealed significant flaws. While the designers instead in later gunnery trials seemed to confirm that muzzle blasts would not interfere between the 13-inch and 8-inch weapons, the mounting arrangement meant that the 8-inch guns could not be used independently. Worse still, a single enemy hit on the 13-inch turret or a mechanical malfunction had the potential to disable half the main armament at once. The 13-inch turrets also featured large gun ports to permit their full elevation 15 degrees up and 5 degrees down, a characteristics critics highlighted as a dangerous vulnerability. Lieutenant William S. Sims, who briefly served aboard Kentucky November 7, 1900 to March 4, 1901, before eventually commanding U.S. naval forces in European waters during World War I, noted that a shell striking a 13-inch gun port could disable the weapon and potentially ignite powder bags stored within the turret or the open shell hoist, causing a catastrophic explosion. On top of these issues, the ship's low freeboard frequently rendered their 5-inch broadside batteries ineffective in rough seas. Just so we're clear, here are the ship's particulars as found in the U.S. Navy battleships 1895 to 1908, the Great White Fleet, and the Beginning of U.S. Global Naval Power by Brian Lane Herder. So to summarize the quote, in a significant failure of the design, a critical shell hit or machinery failure could wipe out half the ship's heavy battery. Moreover, the 8-inch guns could not engage targets independently of the 13-inch guns. The two-story turrets also weighed 728 tons compared to the preceding Iowa's 432 tons. Total Tunyon firing pressure rose to 506 from Iowa's 220 tons. The superposed turret decision triggered a series of cascading engineering issues. A strengthened hull supported the increased weight and firing pressure, and a lowered main deck counteracted the higher center of gravity, but the Kearsarges consequently rode low, their 13-inch main guns just 20 feet above the waterline. Bows became awash in heavy seas, impairing forward turret operation and rendering the casemate 5-inch battery useless. They were at least generally stable gun platforms. The Kearsarges employed a 16.5-inch Harvey steel belt tapering to 4 inches at the bow. Triangular armor, 10 to 12 inches thick, connected the ends of the belt with the sloping protective deck. 5-inch side armor extended to the main deck, 6 inches of superstructure armor shielded the casemate 5-inch battery. The 13-inch turrets were protected by 17 inches of armor. So the battleships had some serious issues with their guns, weight, and being seriously wet, to the point where their tertiary battery couldn't fire properly. But their machinery was generally reliable, and they were stable gun platforms for the main battery at least. Still, the battleships had longer careers, with Kentucky being decommissioned in 1920 and scrapped in 1923, while Kearsarge was converted to something very interesting and something that made it not a waste of steel. USS Kearsarge, one of the few American battleships not named for a state, was an interesting-looking pre-dreadnought in her own right, with 8-inch turrets rigidly fixed on top of her 13-inch main armament, and as common with other pre-dreadnoughts, a variety of other guns. But her time as a battleship, as interesting as it was, is not what we're interested in. No, what we're interested in her in is her crane form. After having served as an active battleship for well over a decade, and then a training ship, This came to an end in May 1920 when Kearsarge was taken to Philadelphia, where Kearsarge was converted into a crane ship in August, Crane Ship No. 1. AB-1, which received a large revolving crane with a rated lifting capacity of 250 tons, as well as 10-foot wide hull blisters, which gave her more stability. This photo is particularly interesting and is one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss Kearsarge. This photo is from October 30th, 1922, where the ship is testing her crane and lifting a 312-ton load on the right and left main hoist with an equalizer at 101-foot reach on an even keel. The jib fore and aft at an angle of 38 degrees 46 minutes. The testing of the crane went well, and this 10,000-ton crane ship served in Boston until 1926, where she was then taken to Puget Sound. In this, the crane assisted in the rearming of several battleships and heavy cruisers, helping to disarm other ships to conform with treaty limitations and support the Navy Yard as it dismantled auxiliary leftovers from the First World War. The crane ship came into its own a decade later in 1936, as Navy planners figured that this ship could be useful with new battleship contracts emerging on the East Coast, where she was taken to New York for a while, being kept in a decommissioned status. Crane Ship No. 1 was then shifted to Boston Navy Yard for work there, reclassified to an auxiliary crane ship on April 15, 1939, and in October 1940, she was assigned to the 3rd Naval District in New York. The sailors of the Navy still continued to call her Kearsarge fondly. However, on November 6, 1941, Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, authorized the service to drop the name Kearsarge and for her to be simply known as Crane Ship No. 1, where she continued to serve different ports up and down the East Coast, assisting in the construction of several vessels. And in May 1942, she was reassigned to the 5th Naval District. Being berthed at Norfolk, Crane Ship No. 1 continued her work throughout the Second World War, handling guns, turrets, and armor for battleships like USS Alabama, Indiana, new guns for Pennsylvania, and cruisers like Chicago, Savannah, and even carriers like Intrepid and Boxer. In May 1943, she went to the 4th Naval District at Philadelphia, where the Army required Crane Ship No. 1's lifting services to support tugs and harbor vessels in New York City later in the year, so she assisted there. When she went back to Philadelphia in May 1944, she resumed her tasking labors on the East Coast. Then after the holidays in 1945, she was taken to the West Coast and ended up in San Francisco, where over the coming years, Crane Ship 1 continued being useful, serving across the West Coast and East Coast, where Joseph McDonald, a master rigger, described Crane Ship No. 1 as a big gray hulk of a thing, which was pulled around by 2 or 3 tugs. But the old girl had brought millions of dollars worth of business to Boston. Without her, we would have never been able to do as many of the big jobs that cost millions of dollars. Even assisting in a tragedy in November 1951 in Boston's Fish Pier, where a collision between 2 ships took place, with Crane Ship No. 1 helping to raise a wreck. Eventually, she was scrapped in 1955, the end of an extremely valuable ship to the Navy, helping to build some of the most modern and powerful ships of the Second World War. This conversion has had my interest for a while, and I think it goes to show the ingenuity of the United States Navy in repurposing such old, outdated vessels. I think this class in their battleship form was a waste of steel. However, when Kearsarge became a crane ship, she certainly had some serious value as that ship. But let me know what you think down below in the comments. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, my friends, have a great week.